In 1885, King Leopold of Belgium was declared the ruler of the new Congo Free State in Central Africa. Unlike most colonies that the world's industrial powers were establishing at the end of the 19th century, the Congo Free State was the personal and privately held sovereign domain of King Leopold himself. It was not, at least initially, a colony of Belgium. The history of the creation of the Congo Free State is an interesting one. It's the story of an imperial project that, for our purposes, frames the extreme limits of Western imperialism. Until about the middle of the 19th century, most of the African interior was relatively free of European involvement. From steamy jungle to hot semi-arid desert, the environment was not particularly attractive to Europeans. And the land fostered harsh diseases that the Europeans had few immunities to. Besides, most of them assumed that there was nothing they really wanted there. But then European states became increasingly interested in developing new markets to export to and for raw materials with which to fuel their industrialization. Around the same time, the financial panic of the 1870s that enveloped Europe and the United States augured a retreat from free trade principles to protectionism and pushed Western nations into a program of conquest and colonization. Europe now developed a form of imperialism based on occupying large areas of the world and administering them from afar. It is not exactly clear when Leopold set his designs on having an African colony, but in the 1870s, he sponsored several explorations of the Congo, ostensibly to improve the lives of the native population there by bringing Western civilization to the natives. Leopold refined the rhetoric of his civilizing mission to Africa so well that when the Western powers met at the West Africa Conference in late 1884 and early 1885, they agreed to grant Leopold personal control of much of the Congo River Basin, covering a roughly 1 million square mile area. To be clear, they were so secure in the superiority of Western culture that it never entered the minds of the delegates at the Berlin Conference that Africans should be free to govern themselves. And the Congo Free State that Leopold created was anything but free. Once in control, he ignored his past pledges to set in motion a plan to civilize the native population. Instead, Leopold's personal administration operated the Congo under the rhetoric of free trade, which in practice was a policy of economic exploitation whose main beneficiary was the king himself. And more than that, Leopold's rule in the Congo was brutal and genocidal. International outrage over Leopold's stewardship eventually would spell the end of the Congo Free State. The Belgian government took over and in 1908 created a colony it called the Belgian Congo. The Belgian Congo was still focused on economic exploitation, but the former brutality and violence carried out under authority of the king was severely curtailed. So what can we learn from the example of the Congo Free State? What does it tell us about imperialism in the second half of the 19th century? And for that matter, what explains Europe's quest for conquest and colonization, which came to be known as the New Imperialism? Imperialism is a word that has so much cultural baggage that it's hard to figure out its real meaning. At the core, imperialism refers to the policy of one nation extending its authority over others through territorial acquisition or by establishing economic and political control. The story of the Free Congo State is admittedly extreme, but in general, the pattern of new imperialism of the late 19th century flowed directly out of the free trade rhetoric of the time that championed removing tariffs and other barriers to trade, and out of the problem of unequal development between industrialized and undeveloped areas of the world. 19th century imperialism followed a progression whereby an industrialized nation first invested capital in a less industrialized country in order to develop methods to extract natural resources, for example, mines and plantations, and to build infrastructure that was necessary for the industrialized Western nation to move resources back home. Obviously, large numbers of natives would be employed in the process, but the goal was to extract resources. Europeans saw this as a good thing because the native population was exposed to Western civilization and was thought likely to be civilized through that contact. Now, in order for the industrialized nation to protect its investments, it eventually took political control of the less developed country, creating what was usually known as a colony, though few Westerners actually settled in the territories that their countries claimed. Sometimes, rather than directly rule a territory as a colony, the Western nation might administer the less developed country or region by creating a protectorate. In this example, the native ruler became a figurehead, controlled and maintained in his position by the military of the Western nation that held the colonial interest. In rare instances, Western nations might create spheres of influence, in which they controlled a local economy but exerted no political control over the territory. Well, that, in a nutshell, defines imperialism and outlines some of the forms it might take. But we still need to understand the rationale for imperialism, the attitudes required of colonial states and their people in order to set out on these imperialistic enterprises. So what were some of the factors that gave rise to the new imperialism? I'll list a few. First, economic. Imperialism was closely linked to questions of development, free trade, and protectionism, as I've tried to make clear. A French prime minister in the 1880s named Jules Ferry put it succinctly: colonial policy is the daughter of industrial policy. Second, social motives. Many Europeans thought that overseas empires could solve social problems as well as economic ones back home. Western politicians frequently argued that the establishment of overseas empires would create new markets and employment opportunities for domestic enterprises. This, it was said, would keep working men and women more satisfied with their lots in life. Some policymakers might have thought that colonies would also be a great way to deal with increased domestic populations, but few Europeans actually settled in the colonies. Third, nationalistic competition. Nationalism is based on the belief that nations should be created out of a shared language, cultural heritage, and history in a specific geographic location. Nationalist rhetoric was and is very powerful, arising out of the revolutionary fervor that gripped much of Europe during the first half of the 19th century. It was crucial in the formation of a unified German state and Italy. But what is this to do with states taking control of overseas territories? Well, nationalistic rhetoric was also very much about power and increasing the perceived greatness of a nation. By the end of the 19th century, the United States and Russia had emerged as two of the world's great powers. European states, not surprisingly, began to develop the idea that the only way to compete politically on the world stage required the creation of large territorial empires, such as the United States and Russia had done. Fourth, cultural motives. Many Europeans saw their duty as being perhaps even divinely inspired to civilize the world along European lines. This was supposedly one of King Leopold's motives for taking over the Congo. The predominant thinking held that railroads, telegraphs, hospitals, and schools, all the things that were thought to have made the Western world great, would transform native lives by exposing them to the benefits of Western society. While this might all sound altruistic or perhaps paternalistic, we need to consider the context of the times. The vast majority of Europeans and Americans in the late 19th century viewed Asians and Africans as inferior peoples. Many political, social, and religious leaders felt that it was their duty to lift the lesser breeds, as it was said at the time, to a higher social level. Let's start with the idea that the people of the world needed to be transformed in the Western image. Many influential 19th century thinkers took hold of Charles Darwin's theories of evolution and the notion of the survival of the fittest, and applied these concepts to social and cultural change. Such proponents included people like Herbert Spencer in England, Auguste Comte in France, Lewis Morgan in the United States, and many others. They suggested that human culture followed a kind of evolution from primitive to barbarian and then to civilized. Western society was, in their view, the most civilized at the time, and was thus the culture that the rest of the world's people should move toward. It was hoped that native peoples in undeveloped regions would welcome the higher culture of the Europeans and Americans. But there was an implicit understanding that Western civilization could be forced on natives who, after all, couldn't know what was best for them. Today, we call this social Darwinism, though at the time the term was rarely used. King Leopold used rhetoric like this as he sought to secure and then develop the Congo for himself. He even created something called the International African Association, which was positioned as a humanitarian organization that would civilize the people of darkest Africa. Many philanthropists, including members of the very wealthy Rothschild family, and scholars initially became involved in the International African Association. But the association dissolved once it became evident that Western economic interests were taking precedence over humanitarian ones. The ideas of cultural evolution and the uncivilized nature of non-Westerners were not uncommon. They sum up pretty well the attitudes of Europeans and Americans toward the rest of the world at the time. In the United States, the official policy of the federal government and much of the population toward Native Americans was closely connected to the same ideas. Now, we need to bear in mind that most of the population outside of Europe and North America had not yet participated in massive programs of commercial and industrial expansion, not until forced to by the Western political and economic powers. If industrialization was the marker sine qua non of modern civilization, then whose job was it to civilize the world? Well, according to the thinking at the time, it was up to the industrialized world to raise up the rest. An illustration from a 1911 French magazine expresses the sentiment quite well. France is shown as a resplendent woman and comes ashore on the coast of Morocco. As the rather dark-skinned natives bow down before her, she showers them with wealth and peace. The natives are clearly in awe and admiration of this lovely European arrival, which is meant to indicate their desire for the benefits of Western civilization. And these supposed benefits often included the benefit of Western political rule. But just as underdeveloped populations of the world were to benefit from Western civilization, Western society would benefit by tapping into the wealth-producing raw materials of the colonies. And Western manufactured goods would return to those same colonies in something of a virtuous cycle. What's more, excess European populations could settle in the colonies, deepening the civilizing project and further strengthening ties with the mother country. It was all very neatly packaged, a win-win situation, if there ever were one. But as we see today, there were also many problems with the underlying assumptions. First, Europeans rarely migrated to Asia or Africa. Instead, they emigrated to the Americas or Australia, the so-called Neo-Europes or New Europes. These were places with climates and culture most similar to what they had left behind. Second, while imperialist enterprises were set up to exploit the resources of the colonies, most raw materials at the time still came from within the industrialized world. And third, the vast majority of world trade, especially in manufactured goods, was also conducted within the industrialized world, not with its colonies. So then, what was the trajectory of the new imperialism? How did it progress? Once underway, the movement progressed very quickly. Within a few decades of the launch of the new imperialism, the European nations and the United States managed to establish control over much of Asia and to carve up Africa and the Middle East among themselves. Prior to industrialization, European settlements in Africa had been few and far between, and most of them centered on the slave trade. Well, of course, the slave trade ended in 1807. But there were other parts of Africa that Europeans had brought under their direct control even before the 19th century. And these relationships would continue long into the future. They included the French in Algeria, the Portuguese in Angola and Mozambique, and the British at the Cape of Good Hope, who, parenthetically, displaced the Dutch settlers before them. After 1880, the principal European states set about to divide up the rest of Africa amongst themselves. Most scholars point to the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885 as the event at which Europeans agreed to the terms under which Africa would be partitioned. Prior to the conference, let's say in the 1870s, only about 10% of Africa was under direct European control. But by the eve of World War I, 30 years after the Berlin Conference, as much as 90% of Africa was under European administration. Only Ethiopia and Liberia remained independent of European rule. Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, hosted the Berlin Conference and drew representatives from throughout Western Europe and the United States and the Ottoman Empire. While the delegates discussed and agreed on several points, including the complete abolition of slavery within Africa and the Islamic states, and some issues regarding free trade policies in Africa, the most important agreement concerned the concept of effective occupation. Effective occupation articulated the principle that it was not enough for a nation to declare a colony in name only. In order for a government to claim a colony, it needed also to occupy the territory it claimed. Occupation could take the form of settlements, the establishment of a military garrison, or even by controlling and operating a mine or industry. Well, this set off a mad scramble by the European states to effectively occupy any area they could in Africa. States with trading posts or other small coastal settlements along Western Africa now sought new opportunities. The Germans created a colony in Southwest Africa. This area of Africa never had a sustained European presence until some German missionaries set up posts in the region in the 1840s. And based on the earlier German missionary settlements, by the early 1880s, German businesses were establishing outposts there and requested German government protection. The German colony of Southwest Africa was born in 1884. The Portuguese had been involved in the region known as Angola since the 16th century. But until the Berlin Conference, their control was limited to coastal forts. By the end of the 19th century, the Portuguese had solidified their control over Angola into the interior. The French occupied a large territory called French West Africa that covered a large swath of territory in the African Sahel. European states that already controlled colonies bordering on the Mediterranean, like France and Great Britain, looked inland to occupy more territory in North Africa. And from the East African coast, the Italians and Germans also moved toward the interior, creating colonies in Somaliland, Tanzania, and Rhodesia. Rhodesia was named for the famous British imperialist Cecil Rhodes, a man who had grand ambitions for creating a vast empire in Africa, from South Africa to Egypt. The son of a country vicar from southern England, Rhodes made a personal fortune in the South African diamond mines. After accomplishing this, he headed north through the interior of Africa, forging agreements for mineral rights with the native rulers as he went. Working with the British government, he also established several protectorates in African territories. Thanks to Rhodes, Great Britain effectively occupied large swaths of territory by the end of the 1880s. For Rhodes himself, the push north was primarily an economic activity, not necessarily meant to civilize natives, though unlike many Europeans, he was well liked by the native African population, probably because he didn't attempt to force European social norms on them. Indeed, he often fell into disagreement with Christian missionaries over the best way to rule Britain's African possessions. Rhodes was among those who expressed the view that European civilization was far superior to any other in the world. Actually, he presented the British as being superior to everyone else. He once wrote, "I contend that we are the finest race in the world, and that the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race. Just fancy those parts that are at present inhabited by the most despicable specimens of human beings. What an alteration there would be if they were brought under Anglo-Saxon influence. Look again at the extra employment a new country added to our dominions gives." There could be no better proof of this, as far as Rhodes was concerned, than Britannia ruling the waves, as the song goes, and what he must have seen as the decay of non-Western world. Indeed, with the decay of the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, the European powers saw an opening to exploit Arab, Muslim, and other resources as well. At the Congress of Berlin in 1878, not to be confused with the Berlin Conference of 1884, at which the Europeans carved up Africa, it was the Ottomans who were in the European sights. At this Congress, the European powers assigned parts of the Balkans to Austria-Hungary, Cyprus to Great Britain, and Tunisia to France. Even before this, Great Britain and France began loaning large sums to local rulers who were trying to emulate European industrialization, mostly in Egypt and Lebanon. This was yet another program of economic exploitation. When Egypt went bankrupt in 1882, Britain occupied the country and took over effective control of the Suez Canal to protect its interests. The story of the new imperialism in Asia is very different from that of Africa and the Middle East. While it is true that from the Western perspective, the great empires of Asia were also in decay, effective occupation there would have been much more difficult a proposition, with one notable exception. Between 1763 and 1857, the British East India Company slowly gained more and more control of India by using a paid native army to conquer the Indian principalities or provinces. In the 1760s, the East India Company was able to exert enough military pressure on one of the Shahs in northern India to get itself appointed the Shah's revenue collector, essentially gaining economic control of a large area of the north. The company slowly extended its military, economic, and political control over more and more regions of India by the middle of the 19th century. After a rebellion in 1857, the British government itself got involved and took control of India in 1858. Though many British administrators admired the once great civilization of India, it was economically exploited just like any other Western colony after coming under British rule. And the British, much like Cecil Rhodes, thought of themselves as far superior to the native population. As a result, Indians were forbidden to serve in military or administrative positions, or even move in the same social circles as did their British overlords. However, the British government built railroads and a communications infrastructure that benefited Indian entrepreneurs as well as the British firms that operated in the colony. Farther east, the Dutch East India Company slowly took control of the East Indies, that is, roughly modern-day Indonesia. And when the Dutch East India Company was dissolved in 1799, the Dutch government took over control of what was now a colony with its rich spice resources. Though Dutch rule was strongest in coastal cities, it was repressive and harsh wherever the Dutch exerted their power. A series of revolts broke out in 1830 and again in the 1880s, but the Dutch were unwilling to give up their worldwide monopoly on the spice trade. So it was that the old joint stock companies, the East India Companies in Britain and the Netherlands, laid the groundwork for eventual European domination of India and the East Indies. The same could not be said of the mainland of East Asia. China itself was a vast empire and far more populated than was any other area the Europeans sought to control. China was also economically self-sufficient, although due to a steady population growth, its agricultural sector was coming under strain. Therefore, China did not need, nor did it want, Western goods. And so free trade was not a concern for the Chinese rulers. But the industrialized Western nations were not about to tolerate being cut out of a huge economy like China's. Only a few Chinese ports were open to European shipping at the time, and the Europeans wanted greater access to Chinese markets. Well, there was one thing that the Chinese population wanted, though probably not to its benefit. You see, the British did find one product the Chinese succumbed to: opium. In their attempt to gain more access to Chinese markets, the British began importing Indian-grown opium into China, and they made a lot of money doing this. But they did so in violation of Chinese law, going so far as to bribe port officials with the poppy seed extract, which produces a euphoric effect when smoked. These British opium traders succeeded at addicting thousands and eventually millions of Chinese people. In spite of an official protest by the Chinese imperial government to British authorities, the trade continued. So the Chinese officials confiscated British opium stores in China's port cities. In retaliation, British warships bombarded several Chinese cities in 1839, starting the First Opium War. The conflict ended in 1842 when, in the face of superior British weapons, the Chinese relented and opened China to Western trade. The opium trade did not abate, of course. Instead, even more Chinese became addicted as an epidemic of drug use reached outrageous proportions. When the Chinese once again tried to block the Europeans in 1856, the Second Opium War erupted. This time, the French forces joined the British, and together they succeeded at occupying Beijing. The Russians and even the United States had minor roles to play in this war in their support of the European powers. The war ended in 1860, with the Chinese opening even more ports to European shipping, allowing European diplomats into the capital, ceding part of Manchuria to Russia, and legalizing the opium trade. Now China was humiliated, and many of its neighbors, which had been under Chinese protection, fell to foreign occupiers and imperialists during the 1890s. France claimed Vietnam and Laos, while newly industrialized Japan took Taiwan. In spite of all of Europe's rhetoric about improving the lot of the non-industrialized world at the outset of the imperial experiment, the so-called civilizing motives were largely forgotten by the turn of the 20th century. Nationalistic competition among the industrialized countries and the policies of economic exploitation came to dominate Western interactions with the non-industrialized world. Did anything positive for the developing countries come out of the new imperialism? Well, I suppose that depends on the individual case and on your perspective. Under Western domination, most regions of the world came to possess Western industrial technologies like railroads, telegraphs, and some modern industries, whether they wanted them or not. Other areas, such as the Belgian Congo, suffered greatly under Western rule, with millions of people dying as European nations stripped them of their natural endowments. But the story doesn't stop there. Even today, we speak of third world countries when referring to parts of the world that are less developed, or perhaps we should say, that developed differently than the first world did. The new imperialism was an early and, most would say, failed attempt to ignite industrial growth outside of the industrial core of the West.